I kept telling myself it wasn't love. I said it was harmless. I said I was just being polite. Nothing physical ever happened. No messages crossed a clear line. But I noticed how often I thought about him. How my mood shifted when his name appeared. And how carefully I started hiding that from my partner. I'm a woman in a long-term relationship that looks stable from the outside. We live together. We plan ahead. And most days feel predictable in a comfortable way. I wasn't looking for attention, excitement, or an escape. I didn't wake up one morning wanting to complicate my life. But a series of small, ordinary moments slowly created a situation I didn't know how to name, or how to stop. If you've ever found yourself justifying something that made you uneasy, I want to know your thoughts. Leave a comment and tell me how you see this so far. And if you enjoy real, uncomfortable stories like this, subscribe and share the channel to support more confessions like mine. Nothing about it felt dramatic at first, and that's what makes it hard to explain now. It didn't start with flirting, secrets, or attraction that I could clearly identify. It started with routine, with familiarity, with the kind of interaction you don't feel the need to monitor because it feels harmless. He was someone who became part of my days almost by accident. Same environment, overlapping schedules, small conversations that filled the gaps between responsibilities. At first, I barely noticed him as anything other than another person passing through my life. We talked about normal things, work frustrations, random observations, things that didn't matter enough to remember later. What I did notice was how easy it felt to talk to him. There was no effort involved, no performance. I didn't feel the need to explain myself or choose my words carefully. Conversations flowed in a way I hadn't experienced in a long time. And I told myself that was normal. People connect. That doesn't mean anything. I reminded myself of that often. At home, my relationship stayed the same on the surface. We ate dinner together. We talked about bills, weekends, future plans. There was no obvious neglect, no fights, no absence of affection. That made it easier to dismiss what was happening elsewhere. I wasn't unhappy. I wasn't lonely in the obvious sense. So whatever this was, it couldn't be a threat. At least that's what I kept repeating. But slowly, I started noticing patterns I didn't want to acknowledge. I would replay conversations in my head long after they ended. I would think of things I wished I had said differently, or moments that made me feel oddly seen. I caught myself anticipating the next interaction, even on days when I told myself I was too busy to care. Still, I drew a clear line in my mind. This wasn't romantic. There was no touching, no confessions, no messages sent late at night. I clung to those facts because they made everything feel controllable. As long as I stayed within those boundaries, I believed I was doing nothing wrong. But then came the subtle shift, the one I didn't notice right away. I began editing what I shared at home, not lying outright, but simplifying, skipping details. If his name came up, I mentioned it casually, without context, as if it meant nothing. And that's when I felt the first real flicker of discomfort. Not guilt exactly, but awareness. I knew, deep down, that if I had to minimize something to make it sound acceptable, it probably wasn't as innocent as I wanted it to be. The problem was that walking away felt unnecessary, dramatic, even. How do you justify ending something that hasn't officially begun? How do you explain discomfort when there's no clear wrongdoing to point to? So I stayed. I told myself I was being mature, that adults can manage complicated emotions without acting on them. That restraint was proof of loyalty. But underneath that reasoning was a quieter truth I didn't want to face yet. Part of me didn't want the closeness to stop. And that realization scared me more than anything else. What would you have done in my place? Once I realized I didn't want the closeness to stop, everything started to feel heavier. Not louder or more dramatic, just heavier. Like I was carrying something invisible that no one else could see. But that pressed against me during quiet moments. I began paying attention to myself in ways I hadn't before. Not to him, but to me. To my reactions. To the way my body responded before my mind had time to filter anything. A slight lift in my mood when I knew I'd see him. A subtle disappointment when plans changed and our paths didn't cross. None of it was extreme, but it was consistent. And consistency is harder to deny. I told myself this was normal. People crave connection. People enjoy feeling understood. It didn't mean I wanted more. It didn't mean I was dissatisfied at home. I repeated these explanations so often that they started to sound rehearsed, even in my own head. What made it worse was how reasonable everything seemed on the surface. There were no obvious red flags, no secret meetings, no private jokes that excluded others. If someone had been watching us from the outside, they would have seen nothing worth questioning. That became my shield. If it doesn't look wrong, maybe it isn't wrong. But internal rules don't disappear just because external ones aren't being broken. I noticed how I started choosing my words around him more carefully, not because I wanted to impress him, but because I cared about how I was perceived. I wanted to sound thoughtful, balanced, interesting. That desire unsettled me. I hadn't consciously felt that kind of awareness in a long time, not even at the beginning of my relationship. At home, I found myself less present in small ways. Not distant, but distracted. My partner would talk, and I'd listen. But part of my attention drifted elsewhere. I hated that about myself. It felt unfair, especially because nothing tangible had happened to justify that mental shift. That's when the guilt started to creep in. Not sharp, not overwhelming, but persistent. It followed me during mundane tasks, while washing dishes, while driving, while lying in bed next to someone who trusted me completely. I asked myself uncomfortable questions that had no clear answers. Was I emotionally crossing a line, even if I hadn't acknowledged it out loud? Was intent enough to make something wrong, even without action? Or was I punishing myself for thoughts I hadn't chosen to have? The hardest part was admitting that I liked how it felt, not in a romantic fantasy way, but in a grounding, affirming way. I liked being seen without having to explain myself. I liked the ease, and liking it made me feel selfish. I considered creating distance, pulling back slightly, letting the connection fade naturally. But every time I imagined doing that, I felt an unexpected resistance. Not desperation, but reluctance, as if I'd be losing something valuable, even though I couldn't justify claiming it. That contradiction sat at the center of everything. I wasn't chasing him. I wasn't trying to replace my partner, but I was making space for something that didn't belong anywhere in my life as it was. And I knew, on some level, that space doesn't stay empty forever. What scared me most was realizing that I wasn't waiting for something to happen. I was waiting to see how far I could go without admitting it meant something. Do you think I crossed a line here? Even without acting on it. By the time I reached the point where I was questioning my own boundaries, I had already crossed one I didn't know how to name. It wasn't visible. There was no moment I could point to and say, this is where it went wrong. And that uncertainty made everything harder to confront. I started becoming aware of how much mental energy this situation was taking from me. Not in an obsessive way, but in a constant, low-level occupation of my thoughts. He was there in the background of my day, even when I wasn't actively thinking about him. Like a tab left open in my mind that I never fully closed. I noticed how my behavior adjusted without me consciously deciding to change anything. I'd time my breaks differently. I'd linger a little longer in shared spaces. I told myself it was coincidence, that I was overanalyzing my own actions. But coincidences don't repeat themselves with that kind of precision. What unsettled me most was how normal it all felt. There was no rush, no thrill that screamed danger. Instead, there was comfort, familiarity, a quiet sense of alignment that didn't demand anything from me. That made it feel safer than it actually was. I've learned that what feels safe is often what slips past our defenses unnoticed. I began to compare things without meaning to, not in a cruel or dismissive way toward my partner, but in subtle contrasts, how conversations flowed, how silence felt, how quickly I felt understood, or not. The moment I caught myself doing that, a wave of shame followed. Comparison felt like betrayal, even if it stayed entirely in my head. At night, lying next to my partner, I would replay the day and edit it mentally, not to hide something specific, but to decide what deserved to exist in words and what should remain internal. That filtering process became exhausting. It made me feel dishonest. Even when I hadn't technically lied, I asked myself why I hadn't just shut it down already. The honest answer was uncomfortable. because shutting it down would mean acknowledging it mattered. And I wasn't ready to face what that would say about me. As long as I kept it undefined, I could tell myself it was temporary, meaningless, something that would fade on its own. But undefined things don't fade. They evolve. I noticed how I became more aware of his reactions, a pause in conversation, a shift in tone. I started reading between lines that might not have been there. That was when I realized I wasn't just responding anymore. I was anticipating. And anticipation is a form of attachment, whether we want to call it that or not. What terrified me was how quiet my justifications had become. In the beginning, I had clear explanations ready for myself. Now, I didn't need them as much. The discomfort was still there, but it had softened around the edges. That scared me more than guilt ever could. I wasn't slipping accidentally anymore. I was allowing it. Not because I wanted to hurt anyone. Not because I was planning to leave, but because I didn't want to confront the emptiness that pulling away would create. I told myself that restraint was still intact, that intention mattered more than proximity. But even as I thought that, I knew I was redefining my own rules to make them easier to live with. The question I couldn't escape was no longer, is this wrong? It was, why am I willing to keep it this close if it is? And I didn't like the answer forming in my mind. Was I being honest with myself at this point, or just avoiding a harder truth? There was a moment, not dramatic, not obvious, when I realized I had started protecting something. Not him exactly, but the space he occupied in my life. That's when everything shifted in a way I couldn't undo. Protection doesn't always look like secrecy. Sometimes it looks like justification, like reframing situations so they sound harmless, like convincing yourself that no one could possibly be hurt by something so undefined. I noticed how defensive I became internally. If a thought crossed my mind questioning the situation, I countered it immediately. You're overthinking. This is normal. You're allowed to have connections. I repeated those phrases until they felt like facts instead of excuses. What disturbed me was how quickly that internal defense system activated. It didn't feel forced. It felt practiced, as if some part of me had already decided this mattered enough to shield. At home, my partner sensed small changes. Not enough to accuse, but enough to ask casual questions. You seem distracted lately. Everything okay? I answered honestly in the narrowest sense of the word. I talked about work stress, about being tired, about nothing specific. And every time I did, I felt a subtle tightening in my chest, not because I was lying outright, but because I was choosing what not to say. That choice lingered with me. It replayed itself in my head long after the conversation ended. I wondered when honesty became selective instead of automatic, when transparency turned into a calculation instead of a default. I told myself I was protecting my relationship by not creating unnecessary tension, that bringing this up would only confuse things, that it would sound ridiculous even to me if I tried to explain it out loud. How do you admit to something that hasn't happened without sounding unfaithful or unhinged? But avoiding that conversation didn't make me feel loyal. It made me feel divided. I started noticing how I compartmentalized my life. Not intentionally, but instinctively. Certain thoughts stayed in one mental space. Certain emotions were only acknowledged privately. I didn't like that version of myself, but I also didn't know how to merge everything back together without causing damage. The truth I didn't want to face was this. Even without action, I had created a parallel emotional reality. One that didn't replace my relationship, but existed beside it. Quietly, invisibly. And that invisibility made it easier to maintain. I asked myself whether this was just a phase, something temporary that would resolve itself if I waited long enough. But deep down, I knew waiting wasn't neutral. Waiting was a choice. Staying silent was a choice. Continuing as things were meant, I was actively allowing something unresolved to grow. And still, I didn't stop. Because stopping would require clarity, and clarity would force a decision, and I wasn't ready to see what that decision might cost me. Do you think protecting a feeling can be as harmful as acting on it? By this point, the weight of what I was carrying had started to change how I moved through my own life. Not in ways that were obvious to anyone else, but in ways that felt deeply unsettling to me. It was like I was constantly managing two versions of myself, the one everyone saw, and the one quietly negotiating with her own conscience. I began noticing how often I checked myself before reacting, before laughing too freely, before sounding too engaged, before admitting, even to myself, how much certain moments meant. That kind of self-monitoring is exhausting. It drains you slowly, because it never fully stops. Even when nothing happens, you're bracing for the possibility that something could. What surprised me was how lonely that felt. Not because I lacked people around me, but because I couldn't share this part of myself with anyone. I couldn't talk to my partner without opening questions I wasn't prepared to answer. I couldn't talk to friends without sounding dramatic or dishonest. And I couldn't talk to him without crossing a line I had promised myself I wouldn't. So I stayed quiet. Silence became my coping mechanism. And the longer I stayed silent, the more justified it felt. I told myself that if no one knew, no one could be hurt. But that logic only worked if I ignored the person being most affected. Me. I started feeling disconnected from my own values. Not completely detached, but slightly misaligned. Like I was living just a few degrees off from the version of myself I respected. That distance wasn't large enough to shock me into action, but it was enough to create constant discomfort. I questioned whether I was being unfair to my partner in ways that didn't leave visible marks. Was I withholding emotional presence? Was I offering less because part of my energy was being spent elsewhere, even if that elsewhere existed mostly in my head? The worst part was realizing that I didn't feel like a victim of circumstance anymore. I felt complicit. No one had forced this situation on me. No one had crossed a clear boundary first. I hadn't been manipulated or pursued aggressively. I had allowed proximity. I had welcomed familiarity, and I had chosen not to step back when stepping back was still an option. That realization came with a sharp wave of self-judgment. I prided myself on being honest, on being someone who handled things directly. Yet here I was, navigating ambiguity because it was easier than confrontation, because it allowed me to delay responsibility under the excuse of uncertainty. I noticed how my thoughts began circling the same questions over and over, without resolution. How much is too much? At what point does restraint stop being virtuous and start being avoidance? Does loyalty require action or intention, or both? There were moments when I almost confronted it head-on, moments when I felt ready to draw a firm boundary, to redefine the situation clearly, to protect what I knew mattered most. But every time I got close to that resolve, fear crept in. Fear of loss, fear of regret, fear of realizing that I had already gone further than I wanted to admit. I wasn't afraid of choosing my relationship. I was afraid of mourning what I would have to let go of to do that fully. And that scared me, because it suggested that this wasn't as insignificant as I had been insisting. The truth was becoming harder to ignore. Even without physical betrayal, I was entangled, emotionally invested enough to feel the cost of walking away. And that realization forced me to confront a question I could no longer avoid. If something feels like it would hurt to lose, doesn't that mean it already matters too much? At this point, do you think staying silent was a form of self-control or self-deception? There's a point in situations like this where ambiguity stops being a shield and starts becoming a burden. I didn't notice the exact moment it happened, but I felt the shift. What once felt manageable began to feel unstable, like something that could tip in either direction depending on one small decision. I started feeling tense in moments that should have been neutral. Ordinary interactions carried a weight they didn't used to have. I became hyper-aware of tone, timing, and proximity. It wasn't about avoiding something happening. It was about managing the constant possibility that it could. That state of alertness changed how I related to both of them. With my partner, I found myself overcompensating in subtle ways, being extra attentive, extra agreeable, extra present, not because I felt guilty for something I had done, but because I was trying to reassure myself that I was still the person I believed myself to be. The irony was that this effort made everything feel slightly forced, which only deepened my internal unease. With him, I became more guarded, but not more distant. That distinction matters. Guarded meant measured, careful, intentional. It didn't mean detached. I was still there, still responsive, still engaged. I was just constantly calculating how much of myself I was allowing to show. That calculation was exhausting. but I told myself it was necessary, that this was what responsible adults did when faced with complicated feelings. But responsibility without honesty has a way of unraveling. I noticed how my internal monologue shifted from justification to negotiation. I wasn't convincing myself this was harmless anymore. I was bargaining with myself about limits. I can stay as long as I don't cross this line. I can keep this connection as long as I don't let it deepen further. Those lines, however, kept moving. What made things more difficult was the absence of a clear trigger. There was no event forcing my hand, no confrontation, no confession, no moment that demanded immediate action. The lack of urgency allowed everything to stretch on, suspended in a state that felt temporary, but was becoming permanent. I began to fear not what might happen, but what might never be resolved. Living in that in-between space created a kind of emotional noise. It made it hard to be fully present anywhere. When I was with my partner, part of me felt like I was holding something back. When I was elsewhere, part of me felt like I was being unfair. There was no place where I felt fully aligned anymore. I realized that my silence wasn't neutral. It was shaping outcomes. By not choosing, I was choosing continuity. By not naming the problem, I was allowing it to define me quietly. That's when the pressure became unavoidable. I started imagining scenarios I had previously avoided. What if this continued another month? Another year? What if my partner sensed something deeper and asked questions I couldn't answer honestly? What if I woke up one day and realized I had drifted too far from my own standards to recognize myself? The thought that unsettled me most was this: if nothing changed, I would eventually become someone who normalized this level of internal conflict, someone who learned to live with divided loyalty. Not because I wanted to, but because I hadn't stopped it early enough. I didn't want that future. And yet, wanting something to end doesn't automatically give you the courage to end it. I was standing at the edge of a decision, aware that stepping forward or backward would change something permanently. The problem was that both options felt like a loss, and I didn't know which one I could live with. If you were in my place, would you force a decision, or let things reveal themselves on their own? What I didn't anticipate was how difficult it would become to keep this conflict contained once it reached a certain size. I had believed that as long as everything stayed inside my head, I was in control. But emotions don't stay neatly confined just because we ask them to. They look for exits, and when they don't find obvious ones, they leak through the smallest cracks. The first signs were subtle. A hesitation before answering simple questions. A delay before responding to messages that had nothing to do with him. A vague sense of unease when my partner looked at me for too long, as if he might see something I hadn't said out loud yet. Nothing was accused, nothing was confronted, but something had shifted. I started realizing that even silence has a texture, and mine had changed. At home, conversations felt slightly less spontaneous. I wasn't hiding anything specific, but I was holding back emotionally in a way that made everything feel flatter. I noticed it most during moments that used to feel easy. Shared jokes, small rituals, quiet evenings. They were still there, but my presence felt diluted, like I was only partially inhabiting them. That realization hit harder than I expected. I had told myself that no one was being hurt by my internal struggle, yet here was evidence that something was already being lost. Not dramatically, not catastrophically, but incrementally. And incremental losses are dangerous, because they're easy to ignore until they add up to something irreversible. I also became aware of how vigilant I was about perception. I started scanning my behavior for anything that could be misinterpreted. I monitored my tone, my expressions, my timing, not because my partner had accused me of anything, but because I was afraid of what even an innocent question might unlock. That fear changed me. I became less natural, less relaxed. I felt like I was constantly managing impressions instead of simply existing, and that constant management made me feel further away from the honest version of myself I valued. Meanwhile, the connection I was trying to regulate didn't disappear. If anything, the tension made it feel more present, not more intense, but more charged. Every interaction felt heavier because of what wasn't being said, because of what both of us were carefully avoiding naming. I started wondering if he sensed it too. Not in a conspiratorial way, not as a shared secret, but as an unspoken awareness that something existed between us that required careful handling. That awareness alone felt like a line I never intended to cross. What scared me most was how easily this could be misunderstood from the outside. If someone had asked me directly whether I was being unfaithful, I would have said no without hesitation. And yet, if they asked whether I was fully emotionally available in my relationship, I wouldn't have known how to answer honestly. That contradiction sat heavily with me. I realized then that the situation no longer belonged only to me. My internal struggle was influencing my behavior, my energy, my presence, and that meant it was beginning to affect someone who had never agreed to be part of this dilemma. That's when guilt stopped being abstract. It wasn't about hypothetical lines anymore. It was about real consequences, about the slow erosion of trust. Not because of betrayal, but because of distance. And distance, when left unexplained, has a way of doing more damage than truth ever could. I knew I couldn't keep pretending this was neutral. Something would have to change. Either I would confront it, or it would continue reshaping my life quietly until I no longer recognized what I was protecting, or who I was protecting it from. At this stage, do you think the damage comes from the connection itself, or from the silence around it? There comes a moment when you realize that avoiding a conversation doesn't prevent its consequences. It only postpones them. I didn't know exactly when that moment arrived, but I felt it settling in, heavy and unavoidable, like a truth waiting patiently for me to stop running. The tension had reached a level where pretending everything was fine started to feel dishonest in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. Not dishonest in words, but in presence. I could feel it in my body, in the way my chest tightened during ordinary conversations, in how I measured my reactions instead of letting them happen naturally. I started waking up with a low-grade anxiety I couldn't immediately place. Nothing was wrong on paper. My life hadn't exploded. My relationship was intact. And yet, I felt constantly on edge, like I was bracing for something I hadn't decided to face. That anxiety forced reflection I had been avoiding. I asked myself whether I was still acting in alignment with the person I believed myself to be, or if I was slowly reshaping my values to accommodate my comfort. That question lingered uncomfortably, because I didn't like how quickly the second possibility felt plausible. What unsettled me most was how normalized the situation had become in my own mind. What once caused immediate discomfort now felt familiar. The guilt hadn't disappeared. It had simply dulled, and that dullness scared me more than panic ever could. I realized that if I didn't intervene, this would simply become part of my emotional landscape, a quiet compromise I carried indefinitely, and the thought of living like that, constantly divided, constantly editing myself, felt suffocating. I considered what honesty would look like. Not just honesty with my partner, but honesty with myself, admitting that this wasn't just a passing distraction, that it had weight, that it had altered me in subtle but undeniable ways, that acknowledging that truth would require action, one way or another. The fear wasn't about confrontation. It was about clarity. Clarity would remove my excuses. It would force me to see the situation for what it actually was, not what I had been calling it to make it manageable. And once seen clearly, it couldn't be unseen. I also began to understand that protecting my partner from discomfort wasn't the same as protecting the relationship. In fact, my silence might have been protecting me more than anyone else, protecting me from accountability, from difficult conversations, from the consequences of my own choices. That realization hit harder than I expected. I had always believed that loyalty meant restraint, that as long as I didn't act, I was doing the right thing. But now I was starting to question whether restraint without transparency was actually a form of avoidance dressed up as virtue. I didn't want to be someone who avoided truth simply because it was inconvenient. And yet, I hesitated, because telling the truth, even partially, meant risking trust. It meant opening a door that couldn't be closed again. It meant accepting that my actions, even the quiet ones, had already shaped outcomes I couldn't fully control. I stood at a crossroads where both paths required courage I wasn't sure I had yet. Say something, and face the consequences of honesty. Say nothing, and live with the slow erosion of integrity. Neither option felt clean. Neither felt safe. But one thing had become painfully clear. Staying exactly where I was no longer an option. If you realized silence was changing you, would you choose honesty, even if it hurt, or continue carrying it alone? Once I accepted that staying silent was no longer neutral, I couldn't unsee it. That realization followed me everywhere. It sat beside me during mundane moments and crept into my thoughts when I least expected it. There was no dramatic breaking point, just a steady accumulation of awareness that made pretending impossible. I began to understand that the real problem wasn't what might happen. It was what already had. I had changed, not in a way that would be obvious to anyone else, but in a way that mattered deeply to me. I was more guarded, more self-conscious, less aligned with my own instincts. I had started managing myself instead of trusting myself, and that shift felt like a quiet loss of integrity. I replayed everything in my mind, searching for an alternative version of events where I handled things differently, where I stepped back earlier, where I named the discomfort instead of negotiating with it. But every version led me back to the same truth. Avoidance had bought me time, but it had also cost me clarity. I noticed how often I rehearsed conversations that never happened, what I would say if my partner asked the wrong question, how I would explain feelings that didn't have clean definitions, how I would frame things to sound responsible instead of conflicted. Those mental rehearsals were exhausting, and they made one thing painfully clear. I was already preparing for consequences, whether or not I chose to speak. That's when I realized something unsettling. Fear had quietly taken the driver's seat. Fear of loss, fear of judgment, fear of becoming someone I didn't recognize. And fear, when left unchecked, has a way of shrinking your world. I didn't want to live that way. I also had to confront an uncomfortable truth about myself. Part of the reason I hadn't drawn a firm boundary earlier wasn't confusion. It was attachment. Not necessarily to him as a person, but to how the connection made me feel, to the version of myself that felt more awake, more seen, more engaged. Admitting that felt humiliating, because it meant accepting that I had allowed something to grow not out of necessity, but out of desire. And desire, even unacted upon, carries responsibility. I started asking myself harder questions, ones I could no longer soften with excuses. If this connection truly meant nothing, why did the thought of losing it feel heavy? If my relationship was my priority, why had I waited so long to protect it clearly? And if I continued exactly as I was, what kind of person would I be choosing to become? The answers weren't comforting. I realized that doing nothing was no longer the safer option. It was simply the most familiar one. And familiarity, I had learned, isn't the same as safety. Sometimes it's just avoidance that's learned to blend in. A decision began to take shape. Not fully formed, not confident, but real. It wasn't about choosing one person over another. It was about choosing whether I would continue living divided, or whether I would finally align my actions with my values, even if that alignment came with discomfort. I didn't know yet how I would speak, or what I would say, or how much truth I was capable of offering without destroying something important. But I knew this. The next step would change things permanently. And once I took it, there would be no returning to the space where this all felt quiet and manageable. If you were standing where I was, would you act to protect the relationship? Or to protect your sense of self? I didn't arrive at my decision in a moment of courage. It wasn't clean or confident or empowering. It came quietly, after exhaustion finally outweighed fear. After I realized that living divided was costing me more than any honest conversation ever could. I chose clarity, not because it was easy, but because continuing the way I was had started to feel like a slow betrayal of myself. The first thing I did was draw a boundary I should have drawn long ago. Not dramatically, not with accusations or explanations that invited interpretation, just distance, intentional, unambiguous distance. I removed myself from situations that required constant self-monitoring. I stopped feeding something I had spent months pretending wasn't alive. That decision alone felt like a loss. Not because I was losing a person, but because I was letting go of a version of myself that had felt briefly seen, briefly expanded. Morning that surprised me. It made me realize how deep things had gone without ever crossing a visible line. Then came the harder part. Honesty. Not a full confession designed to relieve my guilt, but a responsible one. I spoke about disconnection, about drifting, about realizing I hadn't been as present as I should have been. I didn't offer unnecessary details. I didn't shift blame. I owned the distance I had created. That conversation didn't fix everything, but it changed the direction. What followed wasn't resolution. It was rebuilding, slowly, awkwardly, with more awareness than before. I had to face the reality that restraint alone isn't loyalty, and that silence, when it protects comfort over integrity, can be its own kind of harm. I also had to forgive myself for not being perfect, for being human, for wanting, for hesitating. But forgiveness didn't mean minimizing what happened internally. It meant learning from it, understanding how easily we can slide into moral gray zones when we avoid naming discomfort early. Looking back now, I don't see myself as someone who almost cheated. I see myself as someone who learned, uncomfortably, that fidelity isn't just about what you do with your body. It's about what you allow to grow in silence. It's about the choices you make long before anyone else would call them mistakes. I don't know if everyone would agree with how I handled it in the end. I do know that choosing alignment over avoidance gave me something back that I hadn't realized I was losing, respect for myself, and that, more than anything, was worth the discomfort. Do you think I made the right choice in the end? If you enjoy real, thought-provoking Reddit-style stories, subscribe to the channel for more.